The idea that we're going to cover in this video can be a bit of a challenging one. So I want you to sit with it and just let it soak in for a little bit, because it can be a bit of a difficult one to get your head around, or a bitter pill to swallow. And it's the idea of red herrings, which relates to the stories that we tell ourselves. Now, we often like to think of ourselves as reasonable, sensible, logical people, for the most part anyway. But actually, science shows this is rarely the case. Now, research has identified that there are approximately 190 cognitive biases. Now, a cognitive bias is defined as a systematic error in your thinking that occurs when you're processing information that then goes on to affect the judgments and decisions that you make. So in essence, there are 190 of these cognitive biases that are effectively shortcuts that our brain uses to try and make sense of the world and to process information in the most energy efficient way. And this taps into our previous video in terms of the predictive coding model of the brain in terms of being energy efficient. The challenge is that because these cognitive biases filter out the information that we actually receive, and so it filters out the information that actually lands on us, with us, we're often left with incomplete information or subjectively biased information that leads us to make poor decisions. And never more is this the case than with emotions. When we experience these intense, immediate emotions, they drive impulsive decisions, they override rational thinking, and it leads to something called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is where there is an internal conflict, so to speak. So let's say that you've reacted in some way, or you've done a particular action, but that action conflicts with what you believe about yourself or the world, or what you believe about your values, or more commonly, the way that you see yourself, so your self-image. So if your action contradicts your self-image, what we will often do is then rationalize our actions and our decisions with logical explanations that fit the circumstances, but which fits the circumstances after the event has happened. So in other words, we apply our rationalizations afterwards to help us make sense of what happens. So what ends up happening is we create stories that piece together events in a way that helps us to understand and make sense of them, but also that helps us to stay aligned with who we think we are, which means the stories are often not based on objective facts. But because these narratives help us to settle that dissonance, so it helps us to settle the discomfort between our actions, responses, and self-image, we accept them because it helps us to soothe what happened, and it helps us to feel better about ourselves and our actions, and we feel like we have an understanding of why we did what we did. Unfortunately, the downsides of these rationalizations is that because they're made after the fact, and because the brain is using these shortcuts to try and soothe our perception of the events, it means that when we finally get into a therapeutic setting, we bring all of these false narratives and stories with us that relate to ourselves, our past, and the people in it, and the experiences we've had. And that means we bring in lots of superfluous extra information. We bring in lots of information that isn't based on actual facts. And we often end up bringing in a mishmash of information that's a combination of the key points, the central themes, but also the constructed narratives that we've made afterwards to make sense of what happened. And this means that even though we turn up to a therapeutic setting or a personal development journey with the most beautiful intention of resolving our issues and growing as a person to move on with life, because we bring all of these red herrings with us, sometimes we waste a significant amount of time, energy, and resources where we think we're exploring the depths of our mind, only to realize that the problem hasn't changed, because actually we've been following the stories that we've created or that our mind has created rather than dealing with the actual perceptions that caused the event. And so I understand this can be a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, particularly if your personal development journey has been an extensive one. But if the problems are still there, it's potentially a case of you've followed some misleading narratives and you've got lost a little bit in the maze.